Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ross, and thank you to all of you for coming here. In the brief synopsis of our talk, there are 3 questions listed. As a biblical scholar, I have been asked to address the first one. What does Scripture teach about faith and family? This is easier said than done, which is why in what follows, I shall begin by problematizing the topic. Most importantly, we cannot assume that our present-day categories can be easily translated into those attested in the ancient world. When asking a question about scriptural perspectives on faith and family, we are likely to project our own ideas about both concepts. The word family appears on 48 out of 133 pages of the report on the listening phase of the Liverpool Archdiocesan Synod, and the most frequent response to the first question of the listening exercise, where in your everyday life do you experience love, true goodness, hope, and joy, refers to family life. While respondents do not always use the word family in exactly the same sense, in most cases, the term seems to denote either the nuclear family or, when employed by a grandparent, often refers to children and grandchildren. Sometimes other relatives are also mentioned or implied. It would be an exaggeration to say that there were no families in this sense in the ancient world. But it is important to note that even though the English word family comes from Latin, Latin familia is not the same as our family. None of the biblical books were originally written in Latin, though. So what about the original biblical languages? All the books of the New Testament were originally written in Greek. As for what Christians call the Old Testament, or sometimes the First Testament, most of the books were written originally in Hebrew, with some parts in Aramaic. A few of the so-called deuterocanonical books, that is, books which the Catholic Church accepts as part of the Old Testament, but which are not in the Jewish scriptures, were composed in Greek. While in your English translations of the Bible, you are likely to encounter the word family a number of times, and exactly how many depends on the version, neither Greek nor Hebrew have a word that corresponds exactly to the English word family. This is not only a matter of the difference in terminology, but rather it is indicative of how ancients conceived of the world around them. There are several Hebrew terms which in English translations of the Bible are rendered as family, and which in turn have to do with the Israelite kinship structure. The people of Israel, as depicted in the Hebrew Bible, were divided into 12 tribes, originating from the 12 patriarchs. These in turn consisted of what in Hebrew is referred to as mishpacha. The latter is often rendered as family, but this is rather misleading, as this was a kind of unit of kinship of a far wider scope. The closest to our family was the third level of the kinship structure of Israel, Beit Av, or sometimes the plural form Avot, fathers, so house of the father's house. As noted by the author of the article on family in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, this was the kinship structure of Israel in which the individual Israelite felt the strongest sense of inclusion, identity, protection, and responsibility. The phrase, however, is not used uniformly in the Hebrew Bible. At times it appears to denote a unit resembling our nuclear family, but far more often it refers to an extended family and more. In addition to the descendants of a single living ancestor, it could denote male and female slaves and their families, resident laborers, sometimes resident Levites, but also the domicile and land holdings. That's the material features. To return to Beit Av, interestingly, in the Hebrew scriptures, we also come across an analogical phrase, but featuring a mother, Beit Em, literally mother's house. A reminder that the Israelite society was not as straightforwardly patriarchal as it is often envisaged. To now turn briefly to the Greek, there are a number of terms which in some English translations, in certain contexts, are rendered as family. And you have the list of all the terms here. I won't read them all because really the most important of them are two, namely oikia and oikos. And again, especially oikia, similarly to Hebrew Beit Av, is not limited to the spouses, their children, and other blood relatives sharing a dwelling. Rather, it could include a host of other people, such as slaves, freedmen and freedwomen, as well as other dependents. Also, the other key term in our title must not be taken for granted. Suffice it to say that faith is often understood as a set of beliefs, dogmatic propositions to which one must give intellectual assent. But when our Bibles translate the Hebrew terms emunah or emet, or the Greek pistis, this is not what is intended. The semantic range of the Hebrew root amen, or you know the word amen or amen, that we know from Christian prayers, encompasses in the first place notions of reliability and faithfulness, but also stability and constancy. It begins with God, who is a faithful and reliable God, El Emet. Human Emet is thus a response to the divine reliability and faithfulness. Similarly, focus on relationality is the Greek pistis, where the emphasis, however, is on trust. This is why, in looking at examples of how faith is passed on in a family context, we could in the first place consider it as a matter of sharing of one's experience of God's faithfulness, rather than teaching dogmatic statements. Now, having problematized the question, so having told you that there is no family, no faith, and I would say also no Bible, but that's for another discussion, let me offer a few thoughts on our topic, beginning with the Old Testament. Now, generalizations are surely not warranted. But in view of the significance of Beit Av in the Israelite social structure, especially before the development of any more formal educational settings, the household was the main place of religious instruction. The centralization of cult in the temple in Jerusalem meant that household cultic activities were central to the religious experience for the majority of people. Essential to the fostering of the Israelites' relationship with the God of their ancestors was the passing on of the oral tradition. Perhaps the most significant text commanding parents, or at least fathers, as to how to instruct their children, or at least sons, is Deuteronomy 6:4-9, which begins with the Shema, the well-known Hear, O Israel text. Not only was the proclamation of exclusive loyalty to the God of Israel to be recited and explained at home and elsewhere, but what is more, the passage also stipulated a material manifestation in the form of the binding of tefillin, the phylacteries, upon the arm and the forehead, as well as inscribing them on doorposts and gates. And I think we should not underestimate that material aspect, and that pertains also to our homes. It is not entirely clear to what extent women were involved in and benefited from household religious instruction. Yet there are clear examples of theologically literate women, including Miriam, as well as other female prophets. Worth noting is also the figure of Hannah, Samuel's mother, and her song in 1 Samuel 2, which the echoes of which are heard in Mary's Magnificat in Luke 2. A particularly remarkable example from a later period, from the book which is not part of the Jewish canon, but is part of the Catholic Old Testament, is the figure of the mother of the 7 brothers in 2 Maccabees 7, killed before her eyes because they refused to eat pork. The narrative suggests that the son's uncompromising attitude and resolve to die rather than break the law are a result of her own steadfastness and the upbringing which she had earlier provided for the sons. Now, all the above must not mislead us into idealizing ancient Israelite households. Even in the biblical narrative, which provides only a very partial insight, we witness strife, sexual violence, rape, hatred and rivalry, abuse, sexual exploitation of slaves. Not to mention polygamy, or to be more precise, polygyny, which for the authors might not be problematic, but is barely a Western ideal of marriage. But while we need to be cautious with making sweeping statements, in general, in the Jewish scriptures, there is a positive attitude towards kinship structures, of which one's household was the basic manifestation. What is more, on the whole, in spite of some examples to the contrary, the prevalent assumption is that the household is the most natural and appropriate place to introduce one to ancestral cult and the nation's special relationship with the God of Israel. This is important, for things differ considerably when we turn to the New Testament, as we shall see in a moment. Now, Jesus was a Jew, and so were his first followers. While the Old Testament commandment to honor one's father and mother is repeated in several places in the New Testament, in view of the other sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, one may wonder what honoring one's parents would have consisted in. To quote just one, in Luke 14:26, we read, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." Perhaps even more outrageous in that culture would have been to hear Jesus telling the dead to bury their own dead, as attested it in Luke 9:60 and Matthew 8:22. And note that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus, already as a 12-year-old boy, is portrayed as not being particularly obedient. I don't think I would like my son to stay behind in Jerusalem when traveling there. That's, of course, in Luke 2:41-51. The fact that the contemporaries of Jesus and Paul relied so much on kinship structures makes the anti-family tendencies in the early Christian movement all the more remarkable. As the accounts of the calling of the disciples and a number of sayings ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels attest, he expected his followers to leave their own households behind. Although things are not that clear, because when we think of the story of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, recorded in all the synoptic Gospels, it seems that in practice, following Jesus did not always have to lead to a complete severing of one's family ties. More importantly, already in some of the sayings of Jesus, and even more clearly in the letters of St. Paul, we see that the challenge posed to blood kinship in the early Christian movement was accompanied by the creation of fictive kinship relationships based on one's attitude to Jesus. Addressing other believers as brothers, while not unheard of in ancient voluntary associations, was rather unusual. Now, when we move here to the times after the death of Jesus, this is, of course, not to say that actual household structures were not important for the spreading of the good news. Private homes often served as gathering places for the earliest followers of Jesus. And there are a number of individuals baptized together with their entire households. For example, Lydia, mentioned in Acts 16. Or Stephanas, whom Paul baptized together with his entire household. Stephanas and the members of his household were the first believers in Achaia, but it is worth noting that once baptized, they devoted themselves to the ministry, diaconia, to the saints, thus to the ministry to other members of the communities of Christ believers. The focus, thus, was no longer on Stephanas' own oikia, but on the newly acquired brothers and sisters. While Stephanas and his household exemplify believers who remained in one place and concentrated on serving the existing community, Paul, but also Luke and Acts, tell us about couples who traveled and thus together, presumably accompanied also by other members of their household, proclaimed the gospel, serving thus as missionaries, but also providing a gathering place for existing assemblies. The best attested missionary couple, mentioned both in Acts and Paul's letters, are Prisca and Aquila. Notably, however, while in Acts we read that they were a married couple, Paul does not say it, showing that from his perspective the fact that they were married was not what defined their relationship and them. And I would say it's not surprising in view of Paul's own preference for celibacy. It is far more important that they were Paul's co-workers in the spreading of the good news about Jesus. Just as in the case of Stephanas, what we learn about Prisca and Aquila is how they worked outside their own household, although both in their and in many other cases, evangelization, the nurturing of the faith of other household members, must have also been part of their ministry. In the New Testament in general, however, the most explicit passages concerning this come from later New Testament writings, and we shall see that in a moment. First, we note that while in some cases entire households were baptized, in other cases individuals joined communities of Christ believers on their own, perhaps accompanied by friends or some relatives, but not necessarily their spouses. In this regard, 1 Corinthians 7:12-16 is especially instructive. Paul offers here advice to partners of unbelieving spouses, showing that a peaceful coexistence was possible, even if in practice many such marriages must have ended in divorce. And divorce in general was very common in the first century. We think it's common now. We can compare it with first century practices. What I particularly like about this passage is that according to Paul, such a relationship, regardless of whether the unbeliever ever converted, led to the sanctification of the unbelieving party. As opposed thus to a man's relationship with a prostitute, which caused the body of Christ, of which he was part, to become defiled, and that's in 1 Corinthians 6:15-16, a man's or woman's relationship with an unbelieving spouse was not condemned. On the contrary, even if Paul, with his practical mindset, also allowed for divorce in such cases if circumstances necessitated this. So far in this section, I have focused on the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels and the Pauline letters. Now, I will be ending very soon, but first let me say a few words about the letters which also begin with Paul's name, but which testify to a very different understanding of the significance of a household and a much more positive view on marriage. If Paul did indeed write Colossians and Ephesians, and even more so, the pastoral letters, that is 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, this must have been at a much later stage in his life. And if so, he must have also changed his mind on a number of issues. Especially with regard to the pastoral letters, the historical situation presupposed is very different than that reflected in letters such as 1 Corinthians. This is why many scholars do not think that they were composed by Paul himself. 2 Timothy 1:5 presupposes not just 2, but 3 generations of believers when it mentions Timothy's mother and grandmother as having faith, or rather trust. 1 Timothy, on the other hand, assumes a much more developed church hierarchy, and in this context provides advice for bishops and deacons who are expected to manage their households well, suggesting an analogy between their own oikoi and the Christian community that they serve. In Colossians and Ephesians, on the other hand, it is taken for granted that the entire households are Christian, and in this context, advice is given in the so-called household codes to individual groups comprising such households, including husbands, wives, children, slaves, and masters. Where from a sociological perspective, they provide a helpful insight, theologically, they cannot remain unchallenged in their unproblematic acceptance of the submission of women, children, and slaves. So let me conclude now. As we have seen in this very brief overview, our scriptures do not provide any simple answers that could help us solve our current problems. Yet, the polyphony, or at times cacophony of voices in biblical writings, must not be too easily silenced. It is perhaps precisely the messiness of human life to which both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament attest so abundantly, and the fact that there is no perfect model that could be followed, regardless of the circumstances, that as such are highly instructive. They may serve as a reminder that family values, while important, must not be absolutized, and the debate as to what constitutes these values should continue, just as the reflection on what it means to pass on one's faith in today's world, a world very different from that 2 millennia ago, cannot stop. And each generation will have to look for its own answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominika. And we will go straight into the second half of this presentation, which John will lead us through.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out on this wild January night. Can we avoid being either starry-eyed or cynical about adult-child relationships? A woman was asking a friend who has children, what if I have a baby and I dedicate my life to it and it grows up to hate me and it blames everything wrong with its life on me? And her friend said, what do you mean if? Or what interpretation do you put on the teenager on leaving school who says, I owe my teachers a lot, and I'm going to pay them back someday. If you want a definition of revenge, how about this? Seeing your own grown-up children deal with their teenage children. Teenagers, there's nothing wrong with them that reasoning with them won't aggravate. Or as one mature student who was himself a parent once wrote, if Abraham's son had been a teenager, it wouldn't have been a sacrifice. If your baby is beautiful and perfect, and the baby never cries or fusses, and sleeps on schedule and burps on time, then I guess you must be the grandma. There's always a generation gap, always. One year I gave a grandson a book for Christmas. He spent 6 months wondering how to plug it in. But some things remain the same. The Year 7 pupils and their parents attended an open evening, an evening on sex education that was presented for the school by a doctor and a nurse. And at the end, the two presenters encouraged the pupils afterwards on their way home to ask their parents any questions they might have. Well, in the car afterwards, as the father was driving his son home, the son said, "Dad, I was wondering," and Dad's heart began to beat, and his knuckles turned white on the wheel. What was his son going to ask? And how would he answer? And then the boy continued, "When do you think my voice will change?" They say that experience is a comb that life gives you after you lose your hair. So I'm going to use the comb of experience to reflect on what it's been like to be a parent and grandparent. And I'm going to try to address two questions. One is, what does it mean to call home the domestic church? And the other is, what foundations for faith can be laid in the family? For most human beings on the planet, the most important thing they do in life is to bring up children. The importance of the job of a mother and father cannot be overestimated. Throughout history, the Catholic Church has always regarded the family as the most influential factor in shaping and nurturing the faith of each generation. All the official documents of the Church confirm that parents are the first and the primary educators of faith for their children. And theologians have emphasized the central role that parents play in bringing up children in the faith. Well, I'm drawing upon my experience as a father of 4 children, now aged 47, 45, 44, and 32. Don't ask me about that. And grandfather of 6 more, aged between 23 and 8 years old. So family life, close proximity, regular touch, constant and unplanned verbal exchange, mutual accommodation, frequent sharing, rhythms of argument and reconciliation, times of undisguised vulnerability and disappointment, punctuated by occasions of elation and celebration. These are all part of family life. Each member of the family should be recognized for his or her idiosyncrasies, specialness, and uniqueness, with a mixture, probably, of appreciation and respect, irritation and tolerance, amusement and wonder. As one Irish educator, I've forgotten his name, once said to parents, "Celebrate the child you have, not the child you hope to have." My late friend Daniel O'Leary quoted a mother. And the mother had written, "I've come to realise that everything that serves the life of our family, the daily baths, the messy meals, responding to calls for a drink of water in the middle of the night, the laundry, the bills, the hurting, the forgiving, all of this is holy." And then Daniel commented, "In the early Christian community, parents were called the priests of the domestic church, consecrating the daily bread, the nightly tears, the constant sacrifice, these informal, raw and messy sacraments of the home. The family has always been treated as vital." Parents can awake the sense of God, the first steps in prayer, educating the moral conscience, forming the Christian sense of human love as a reflection of God's love. And recent research backs up what the church teaches, that parents are still the most influential factor in whether or not children remain or continue to be Christian. The research strongly suggests that parents do exert a powerful influence, more than we often give credit for. But not only do parents communicate the gospel to their children, but they also receive the same gospel from their children. In 1981, Pope John Paul II taught not that the church shows what the family should be like, but the other way round. The family shows what the church should be like. And we should remember that the church is holy, not because it is perfect, but because God's grace is at work in it. And the quality of family life is not guaranteed by the religious faith of the parents, even though this matters a lot. Rather, the quality of family life is more influenced by their love for each other and for their children and for others. A really wonderful little book by Ronald Rolheiser that I read just before Christmas is called Domestic Monastery. And it brings out something very strikingly that you might find surprising. How similar being a parent is to being a monk. Here is an extract. To see your own child is to feel what God must feel when God looks at us. Parenting is the most natural path to holiness and maturity. It often takes us where we would rather not go. Among all loves, parental love is perhaps the one that most pulls your heart out of its self-love. Parenting reshapes the core of your being to help you to love more like God. To be a parent is to nurture a child as he or she passes through very different stages of growth: infancy, toddlerhood, nursery, primary school, a teen with raging hormones and sometimes raging attitudes, a young adult, an adult with his or her own responsibilities and unique sorrows. And if you have more than one child, as I've been blessed, then each one has a unique personality that you have to adapt your love toward. All of this demands that you constantly grow, readjust, adapt, learn to love in a new way. To be a parent, Ronald Rolheiser said, is to find oneself enrolled in a school of love that is every bit as ascetical and grace-producing as any monastery. Because one of the tricky things is that we simply don't know how things will turn out for us as parents or with our children. What works or seems to work for other parents may not work for us. to a certain extent, we all have to figure it out for ourselves as we go along. Even more of a challenge is we have to keep on figuring it out for ourselves, because what works when a child is 5 may well not work when she or he is 10. What works for one child may not work for a brother or sister. We might struggle to remember how fulfilling and ennobling parenthood can be when our baby has kept us awake all night, or when our toddler is kicking off about some minor incident, or when our teenager is resolutely refusing to listen to a word we say. By a strange paradox, though, wanting the best for our children brings us great rewards of joy and fulfillment and love. And our task is to prepare the soil, to irrigate it with love, to prevent weeds, or try to prevent weeds from growing, or from choking or strangling tentative growth in our children. God provides the seed, and in plenty. Forced artificial respiration and preparation does not support a resilient and natural development. God is not in a hurry to catch souls. We must not rush to produce results in this aspect of our lives. There isn't a time when everything has to be known, when our vocabulary or that of our children has to be complete, nor is any setback the last opportunity. Defeats are part of a lifelong campaign of retreat and advance, of growth and interdependence. I believe very firmly that the handing on of holy things is inextricably linked to the handling of ordinary things. We sometimes separate what we think is holy or sacred from what is ordinary, as if God was reserved for holy places, holy times, holy people, holy activities. But if God is God, then all the places belong to God, all time belongs to God, all people are called to be holy, all actions are open to the grace of God. We do not get to God in bypassing the ordinary, but in how we treat it. The domestic church is where biology opens up into biography, and then into sharing God's life. We start with what earth has given, then with what human hands have made, and then we open ourselves to God's transforming love. The family is where community not on the basis of self-selection, you never choose the family you're born into, where community can open up into church. In the domestic church, the liturgy of life includes bodily functions, their development and their decline, eating and drinking, sexuality, sharing things, play, experiment, reconciliation, disciplining of our affections, that is, learning to love things in the right way, story, and celebration. We might say that the curriculum and the syllabus of communicating faith in the home includes body and touch, food and meals, routine and habit, play and exploration, children and the elderly, celebration and our use of time, conversation and stories. When it goes well, family life can offer love and affirmation, example, habits, correction, assumptions, companionship, sharing, celebration, pleasure, relaxation, a reinforcing social environment, prayer, stability, and continuity, and some teaching, although none of this happens through direct, explicit teaching or any formal language. Insofar as parents can honestly say they do some of the following list I'm going to share with you, then they are already preparing the human soil to receive the gospel. if you as a parent have been doing any of the following: be present, pay attention, listen, wait, welcome, invite, be hospitable, share, bless, give, forgive, reconcile, heal, celebrate, encourage, be vulnerable, pray. Insofar as parents are doing some of them, they are already preparing the human soil to receive God. Children need just 2 minutes. Children excuse me. Children need many things from us as parents. These include at least some of the following: attention, affirmation, time, patience, love, listening to, example, teaching, increasing amounts of independence, staggered carefully, forgiveness, correction, encouragement, protection, play, guidance. Children, like all of us, should ultimately be seen not as a bucket to be filled or as a problem to be solved or managed, but rather as both a gift to be appreciated and a mystery to enter into. We won't be perfect parents. I don't think there are such people. Families can be places of conflict, fear, bad example, confinement, of being put down. They can be distressing and diminishing, places where we get bruised. We need to put the myth of the perfect family out of our minds and focus instead on real families and the real good we can do in them. I've tried to adopt an approach which shows a chastened confidence and a hopeful realism about what is possible. Parents genuinely teach a good deal by their approach to daily life, and they need to trust God that their children will grow in him, both because of and also often in spite of their example. So in conclusion, in conclusion is always a good way to wake up an audience. Never underestimate the power of parents to influence their children for good and to witness to their faith through their humble efforts in the midst of the pots and pans, the toys and the tantrums, the cuddles and the confrontations of everyday family life. And nor should we ever underestimate the influence of our children on the testing, refining, stretching, deepening and expansion of our own character and faith. Thank you.